The South has crops, moisture, and heat, and you up north, China gets dry. So they need produce and food from the South to exist. Basically, that area is an alluvial plain of the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. I need a pointer, and my daughter suggested I ought to get a chopstick for one. But any rate, I can't quite reach it, but the Yellow River goes above the peninsula. Maybe I need a cane. Here, and this area is an alluvial plain from the Yangtze River that goes from above Chongqing down this way, and the Yellow River now flows up here, but actually just north of here, I don't know how many hundred years ago, maybe 1,000, it flowed out here. But basically that area is seasonal. In the winter, it's cold, down in the teens. And in fact, we had an ice house and we'd fill it with ice, and it was always a question, would that ice last to my sister's birthday in June? Because we used it mainly for making ice cream and, of course, keeping food cold. So when we ran out of ice, that ended the ice cream. But yeah, the summers were extremely hot. People called it the furnace. And temperatures were up between 90 and 100 day and night. Yeah. And of course, when we were born, it was old China. There was no electricity, no water supply other than what was carried in buckets from the river or canals, and no sewer system, no paving, strictly just countryside, and flat country at that, and no trees. And food was so rare, people would strip the trees with their bark and eat anything they could. And it was a period when you think of poverty, you haven't seen poverty unless you've seen that era. People in raggedy clothes and starving. And it was also an era that it was basically a British province, you might say. The Grand Canal that we lived on, Butterfield and Squire ran the barges. They ran it, all over the world. And of course, they supplied opium. They had an opium war in the 1840s. And when the British, of course, conquered, they just supplied opium and got tea in return. Took tea. But I remember seeing, growing up, old men very in reduced situations, suffering from drug. When we entered this world, we were still in the warlord period. The empire of the Qing, and I guess that's where Chinks come from, had collapsed and kind of withered away, and there had been a struggle like there was, when the Russian Empire collapsed. Some people wanted to restore the old system. Fortunately, in China, South China, the Hong Kong area, there was a Chinese-American doctor, Sun Yat-sen, that prevailed and formed the Nationalist Party. And he wanted to emulate a republic similar to the United States. But when we were born, our territory was still in turmoil and ruled by warlords. You want to throw them up? There they are. They're not look like your normal Chinese waiters, do they? But you can see warlords is a misnomer. They're actually for peace. They want peace and quiet and prosperity. because the more they can keep the things under control, they get a better taxation on the population. But you can look here, you can see he's the tough guy, and that's his military arm. You can look at his whole staff, and you can spot, here's the quartermaster providing the food, and here's some couple of innocent Americans out there. This is Dr. Nelson Bell, if you've heard of him. I can tell you more about him. But you look back here, he's got educated people. You know, just like the warlords in Afghanistan. They sent their families to Eton in England. And they were educated, knowledgeable, and knew the British commanders. And these guys were somewhat the same way. But they were for peace. War is a misnomer. And any fighting they did with silver bullets. They'd buy out the aggressor, buy his soldiers away and put them in hit their army. Any questions about him and those scenery? These innocent Americans in among those tough guys. Now this is our home in China, and amazingly, it still exists. It was built in 1925, 1926, and it's still solid. This used to be, in my life, a sleeping porch, and this was a screen porch, and these trees are hickory and pecan, and I don't know, we had apricots and just any kind of several fruit trees. In fact, a lot of our table food, like lettuce, asparagus, cabbage, we raised ourselves because we didn't want to get the produce that was nourished by night soil. So we raised chickens and ducks and had milk goats. One of my children as a young kid, 4, 5, 6, 7, was milking those goats. And of course, if you ever had goats around, they're fun. The little, what do you call young goats?
Kids.
Yeah, they're really fun. Yeah, they like to go to the high places and stay up there and defend it against the others. But
You had 2 pet ducks?
yeah, I had ducks, a pair, and they'd be waiting for me every morning. And would just be with me all day. Anything you were involved in, they'd have their beaks in there, they'd be involved too. And one Sunday I came home, and my mother said, "Eat your duck, son." And I looked at the French door, I looked out, it was my duck. So that was one time I didn't follow my mother's advice. I didn't eat that duck. But at any rate, it's amazing to me that this house is restored by the government, and we visited there in '88, and it was in good repair. In fact, the authorities paid the mission for it, you know, even though they started off, it went through the communist era and various eras. But my brother and I were standing on the front porch right here, and we were suddenly surrounded by young ladies, obviously clerical help, because when we came in from the street, they had a big sign over the gate door that showed a...
Why don't they where?
What?
Point where?
Well, it doesn't show the gate coming in from the street, but they had a big sign up of the earth with red flowing down over it, which was communism going over the world. So at that time, this house was being used by the government for the propagation of communism for that district. So we were standing there, and these young clerical girls came out, real attractive, and I told them, you know, I was born in this house, and I can show you exactly where. And so they grabbed my arms and pulled me in, and we went through the entrance and through the living room and dining room, pantry, and into the kitchen. And I swear on that, in the kitchen, there was a white enamel table that I had been born on. I started my life right here. That's amazing. And as I went out, we passed the steps going up to the second floor. And I said, have you all been in there and gotten under this platform and found the trap door in the floor? And they said, no, we didn't. And they said, you know what's under that trap door? And I said, probably nothing now. But the turbulent times that parents were there, they had to refugee several times. In fact, right after, 2 months after I was born, they had to leave. That was when the nationalists were pushing north, and the big controversy was between the nationalists and the communists, and of course the local militias and so forth. But they would put my mother always used her wedding silver and crystal. Her idea was that, we never know about the future, but let's take advantage of what we have. So very few people have been raised with silver and crystal, I think. Maybe in your house you do, I don't know. But we passed the steps going up, and I pointed that out to them. They said, no, we didn't know anything about that. And of course they asked, is there anything there? And I said, I don't think so. But as soon as they escorted me to the door, I looked back and it already...
Look back at what?
Yeah.
You look back at what?
This is my childhood, my
Looking back.
younger brother.
Trap door.
Yeah,
Yeah. And,
and he looked back and what?
And he stopped.
when I was born, I had
Trap door under the stairs.
older sisters. 10 years older was my oldest sister. And so I had a happy childhood. I was well taken care of. And, the first boy in the family and 3 sisters, I was really
Your
pampered.
father
Yeah. So
lost faith 3 times.
what's that?
Your father lost faith 3 times having daughters.
Yeah, that was kind of a black mark against him, but he got restored when his boy finally showed up. But at any rate, we had a wonderful childhood, and in spite of the turmoil and difficulties going along outside the family, we saw no sense of that from our parents or our friends. We all had just completely joyful, peaceful childhood. Just amazing. This is really a poor picture. This is inside our city. We had the Grand Canal on the other side here. It was a wall city with crenellations, with square holes for the archers, and it was still existing up until I think the 50s, and it got taken down and a ring road was put in, a super highway. There were no highways when we grew up. There were just paths and dirt and no pavement. But anyway, this is a park inside the city in this temple, and it was a beautiful park that we would enjoy. But this wall has a circumference of about 5 miles, and it was a tradition every New Year, the families in that area would gather, and after a New Year's feast would make a walk around the city on top of the wall, which was quite a nice thing to do. And of course the wall we used quite a bit, flying kites, for example, and the Chinese also enjoyed kites. And one of the things, the kites would have battles. You'd put granulated glass, glue it to your string, and try to cut the other one down. And we lost a lot of kites. We weren't as skilled as the Chinese were. And also another thing was pigeons. There were many pigeon flocks of a similar coloring, and we'd go up to fly the pigeons, and one of the Chinese would send up his flock, and they want to try to capture your flock and bring it down, and we'd have to go back and buy them back. And we just weren't as successful with that as others. But that wall was a great experience, and it served, you know, had massive wall doors at 4 compass points, and they had a drum tower that sounded at night when the doors were going to be closed, and again in the morning when the doors were open. But they're massive. They still exist, but the wall is gone. This is what those gates look like. But of course, this is a recent picture, but in our era, the houses were right up to a single lane on each side, and crowded with homes. But the walls, their defense, are still there. I mean, the gate. Okay, you want to move it? Oh, I didn't want that. That's a raggedy bum. That's the family. And of course you recognize me, but my clothes are oversized, poor little brother. But they would dress you for a little bit oversized so the clothes would hold up for several years. But that's obviously, pass it on. That's my little brother. And that's in our yard, a new walkway that was put in. Well, we did have a lovely yard, and unusual, we had almost an acre there. It must have been a very wealthy person that committed suicide, and the property was haunted and nobody wanted it, so we were very fortunate that Mitchell was able to get it. And that's another picture of the house.
That's from 2013.
Yeah, that's a recent. It's in marvelous shape when you consider it's, 90 years old? And they have enclosed the sleeping porch and the...
That doesn't look like the same house to me.
It is.
It's the
You
same
don't
one.
have your porches.
No, they don't.
They enclosed them.
They enclosed it. And this is from inside the city. It had a park or lake. And this is part of the wall.
The pagoda.
Pagoda, yeah. That was built in about the 10th century for a particular honored scholar, poet. I didn't know I'd see that again.
Is that you?
That's me as a
10 years old.
pre-fees.
Is that you?
Yeah.
10 years
How old
old.
were you there?
10, my
10.
daughter says.
It's dated 1937 on the back.
Yeah, and that's the family. And
That's in
You said 10
Japan.
years old when you went to Korea,
yes,
and you were on the train with your guide.
my guardian, yes.
And what did you do?
Well, that was when the Japanese-Chinese war came in our area, and I was 10 years old and went to, the family evacuated to Korea, and of course Korea was occupied by Japan, and in contrast to China, everything was peaceful. You know, kind of like the Roman Empire, everything inside was peaceful. So peaceful that I was put on a train in South Suncheon, right on the south coast, to go north on the train by myself. Of course, my mother knew that I would have a minder as a secret agent they would put with you. And he was a man dressed in a British suit, bowler hat, and an umbrella, briefcase. And we shared a compartment, and he tried to drink me under the table, but at a 10 or 12-year-old, I took him down. And when we got off the train in Pyongyang, I knew where the school was and knew how to get there. So I got off the train and was walking through the
He was out.
large area. He was out on the train, but he recovered and came running out with his umbrella in the air. Wait for me, wait for me. But it was peaceful in an occupied country, well, and I spent 6th, 7th, and 8th grade there and came back to high school in this country. That was in '39.
Jim, you were speaking Chinese, I presume?
Oh, yes, fluent. Korean, I never, only had roughly 3 years, so I didn't get real good at Korean. Kunap Sindida, if you have any Korean friends.
This was in 1927 when your parents
Yeah.
had to go to Japan when you were a baby.
Yeah,
That's your parents. Tell
Yeah.
who it is.
yeah, yes. The good thing about that situation, my mother had the kids with her in Japan for close to 3 years. And she's a natural linguist, learned Japanese in addition to Chinese, which was a real blessing when the Japanese occupied our area. You know, they started that war with China in 1933, I think, but they didn't really reach our area until they invaded the mainland China in '37. Took them 2 years to work their way up from Shanghai area to our area. But my mother was able to communicate with them, and my dad to some extent. But he's not the linguist that my mother is, because she always would have groups of women meeting with her, and so they had a great deal of conversation. You know, they, in Japanese, if you know it, they have, when you answer the telephone, they have a, I think, moshi moshi. And my dad said, mushy mushy, which tickled the Japanese staff that was there. But he ended up administering Dr. Bell's hospital. It was the largest Presbyterian hospital in the world at that time. The facilities weren't all that big or grand, but the patient load was huge, because in that pre-modern era, every summer they had all the tropical disease, yellow fever, scarlet fever, and Calazar was something that's been eliminated, but they had a huge migrant hospital load. Want to move ahead?
I think that's the last of the pictures that
Is
we
it?
have, yes.
Okay,
We can go back to the map
yeah.
if you want.
One thing most people don't realize, that along up the Yangtze, above Nanking, is an amazing mountain system, about 60 miles long and 30 miles wide. Beautiful, beautiful mountains up to 5,000 feet. And kind of a scallywag New Zealander missionary somehow bought the property from a drunken Buddhist priest that was an outlaw. And this was back during the Empire days, when it was the only property you had was, well, the British, of course, took over settlements. Then they would put a consul and a gunboat by it. And of course they had tremendous trade with China back up maybe 1,200 miles up the Yangtze in cotton trade. They shipped back to England for weaving or for getting woven there in China and shipped to their country. But anyway, that was located way up in here somewhere, large area. And of course Shanghai, and then Hong Kong is down about here. And the Grand Canal runs from below Shanghai 1,200 miles up to near Beijing.
Where you lived was south of Beijing, huh?
Oh yes, yes, Beijing was maybe 600 miles north. And as a child, we never got up there. We would come down. Well, the first time realized that we were living in an unusual place was about when I was 10 years old, went to Shanghai, which was a modern city, and the British concession there had stores, and the department store even had an escalator in it with, you know, elevators and so forth, very modern. But along the waterfront, they had a park, and the sign in the park said, "No Chinese dogs allowed." No Chinese dogs. And of course, I've seen that sign, and the Chinese left it there. I think they finally got it taken away. But you can see the British were not appreciated. Americans were, because we never took a concession. We never made a British, like the British made a concession, the French made a concession, and like the French part of Shanghai was just like Paris, and the British part was just like London. But the Americans did not do that. And I remember once going through Shanghai on the waterfront, there were an American sailor and Marine coming up the pier, and there were Japanese on the pier, and they were beating Chinese dock workers, coolies. Well, when the Americans got there, they grabbed the rifles away from the Japanese and broke them over their heads and kicked them off the pier. And there was, you know, a crowd of hundreds observed this, and that word, you know, they realized that America's for the underdog. Any other thoughts or questions you want to ask? Okay.
When you went to school in Korea, can you tell us a little about the school? How big was it? What other kids were there?
It was in Pyongyang itself, and it had boarding for boys and girls, and the walkway between the housing for the boys and where the food was served was so cold in the winter you break ice in your nose. You know, it's 20 below, as a lot of people found out. North Korea is cold. You know, and I was a Boy Scout age there, and we camped in North Korea one time, the Diamond Mountains, and that was surveyed by Hoover during his period as an engineer. And they apparently did have diamonds. Beautiful country, but very difficult to live in. Yeah, but during the summertime, it's delightful.
That's where all the missionary kids went, isn't it?
Well, those that could, yes. So that's one thing about missions, and of course my mother really suffered under this, because when the kids got about 6 years old, that was about the limit that homeschooling could do. We were schooled with a Calvert correspondence system, but about the 6th grade, almost all the kids were sent to school somewhere, Shanghai, Pyongyang, Kuling, which was up in the mountains. But that was the thing that she really felt as a real liability for what she was doing.
But you went to school with the Chinese children then?
With our family, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
She did.
No,
So,
no, they had homeschool.
You had homeschooling?
up till 6th grade.
6th grade?
Well, yeah.
Oh, I
first,
went away. I was thinking 6 years, no, 6th grade.
6th grade was my first
Uh-huh.
organized school. Yes.
One of the earlier pictures you had Dr. Bell.
Uh-huh.
Is that Billy Graham's wife's father?
Yes, his father-in-law, and I have the book of his, which really describes very well what our situation was. Yes.
On the map you indicated in China where you had a certain belt of cotton being raised there.
Yeah.
Were the silkworms everywhere, and did the children help harvest those for the silk? or was it in a prominent area within the China?
Yes, it was in a separate area of China. The climate of most of China wasn't conducive to mulberry,
Okay,
and so it was more on the mountain slopes.
mountain slopes?
Yes, even this cooling area or the Tibetan slopes, where the climate was more acceptable for them. But they did have a lot of silk fabrics and embroidery, and very beautiful. In fact, that warlord you see, well, no, it wasn't one of those, but the imperial governor of our province was a big man. The Chinese empires, for way back, the 1600s or more, actually earlier than that, 1300, 1200, they used non-Chinese as governors. Manchus, ever since Genghis Khan, they used people other than Chinese to be part of their administration. There was less chance for corruption or whatever. But he was a huge man, and my brother somehow obtained that robe. I don't know exactly how, but his son has that spread out on the wall of his going upstairs. It's a big enough place, and it's a beautiful garment. He was a big man. Mongols and Manchu, North Chinese are much bigger than the Chinese you see around in this country that come from South China, around Hong Kong. But it's a huge thing, elaborately brocaded with silver and gold thread. Wonderful piece, museum quality, really. Anything else? Yes.
How successful was your mission?
My gosh, you can't believe it. It was about 150 people when we left, and now I have a picture of it. The downtown church has 4,000 members, and actually has propagated maybe half a dozen other churches, and they're packed. If you ever make a trip to China, you ought to visit. And the communists, here's a picture of the local church there. And, during the communist era, when the missionaries were kicked out, the church just multiplied. It's just unbelievable. And one thing that the communist government did, which they ought to do in this country, our government, they said, you're all Christians. You'll be called Christians. You won't be called Anglicans or Episcopalians or Baptists. You're a Christian. So they merged them all together. And of course that forced the administration, it's strictly local, no foreign interference with their church business. And they do a wonderful job.
Isn't it true that the first Christian Sunday school system was started by your father?
Oh, several, many. Yes, but they were very small. And of course, it's still a small percentage-wise, but they do have great influence. And surprisingly, the government, whether it was communist or otherwise, did not harass the church except during the period of the Cultural Revolution, where the young people just went wild all over the world. They did it in this country also, the hippie period of the 60s. They didn't get quite as wild as they did in China, where there was serious persecution. But the church just mushroomed under that. But when you visit a church now, you can tell that its origin was Episcopal or Anglican or whatever. And unfortunately, the Catholics did not participate in that. They held out to be a foreign administration, they wanted to be administered from Rome. And that was a big mistake in my opinion, but that's what they did. Yes?
How long did your parents stay?
41 years. They started in 1917 in China, and then was finally forced out
71.
Well,
60.
he retired from the Taiwan, actually, in 71. They were forced out of China about the 50s during the communist takeover.
How did World War II affect you all?
Well, we had to refugee, that's when we refugeed to Korea.
And you want to tell about your parents being in the concentration camp?
Well, I can. But my dad went back, and he was there during the start of World War II. In fact, my mother and little brother were. And he ended up being liaison for the church that Dr. Bell managed or created. Well, it was actually created before his era. It was back in the late 1800s. But he ended up being the administrator and the liaison between the Chinese staff and the Japanese for several years. And surprisingly, the Japanese that administered that part of their occupation was from North China. It was the prince of the Japanese emperor that did the horrible massacre in Nanking, killing some 400,000 people.
What was his name?
The Japanese,
The emperor that killed.
I don't,
The emperor that killed.
yeah, Hirohito. Hirohito was the Japanese, and the general of the Southern Army was one of his nephews or princes. And of course, MacArthur ended up pardoning all of the royal family of Japan, even though probably the worst individual in World War II was the nephew of the Japanese emperor. But that was one of the commitments he made, which probably was the right thing to do, because it certainly kept the Japanese under control. He was MacArthur ran the country.
Did you end up in your mother and father were in the concentration camp?
Yes, and my little brother.
How
Well,
did they end up?
actually, they were under house arrest in August 41. Roosevelt was trying to control the spread of Japan and cut off financial credits, and shut down their business, and they were put under house arrest it lasted for 2 weeks. They were pushed up to the second floor of the house that they were in with a Japanese squad on the first floor. And of course, like many people found out, Japanese don't take care of prisoners, and they had to rely on food thrown up from the street from friends to grill upstairs. So they had a pretty tough time, really. But before that, my dad delivered 2 barges, and he wore a money belt with gold leaf and money to finance the hospital operation for 6 months. And they went through the battle lines. The Japanese let them through, crossing the Yangtze River. And there was a no man's land about artillery range apart, close to 12 miles. And they were stopped by irregulars, guerrillas or bandits, you don't know. But he was able to meet with them and negotiate. And finally he got passage by taking his wallet out and said, "You take half and I'll keep half. I can see that you're loyal Chinese and you're fighting the Japanese." And that settled that. And I asked him how much was that. He said it was about $50 we split. Wasn't very much, but for 2 barges of medical supplies and a payroll, they didn't search it, fortunately. So he was carrying quite a bit of responsibility. But at any rate, he got it through, and the hospital continued operation through the Japanese occupation. And finally was shut down when the communists took over. And it's still an active hospital, but it's run by the Chinese government. And surprisingly, they actually set up a museum of the early hospitalization there with Americans, doctors and staff. It was a teaching hospital, and they ended up with a very good medical staff. And during the war, there were a couple of occasions that the Japanese troops would get drunk and try to enter the compound, which included nurses. They had a nursing school, maybe of 100 to 125 training nurses. But surprisingly, the Japanese had turncoat Chinese, supposedly, which were despised. They were called Irwang, which is yellow, number 2 yellow, and Iwang, which is 1 yellow. But it turned out that the Irwang was actually a loyal Chinese, and he would always send a warning runner out to warn the hospital that the Japanese were on the way to inspect, and they would clear out all the men, because they treated everybody that needed treatment, whether they were Chinese, communists, or whoever, bandits. But they'd get the men out before the Japanese arrived, otherwise they'd have been stabbed in the bed. But, yes.
One more question. Are there any books that you'd recommend for reading about that part of history?
Well,
Other than the one, I saw you had one up there.
Yeah, I had one. That's the one on Dr. Bell's work in China, which dated from about 1920 up to, well, the start of World War II. I don't know if it's published, but whether you can get it, I don't know.
I mean,
But,
all I've really read is Empire of the Sun, so I.
yeah. But that is a very good description, maybe a little bit too agreeable, but it's interesting. It's passing around. I don't know where it is right now. Yeah.
How did your sisters and brother turn out? I mean,
Say it again?
how did your sisters and brother turn out? Did they come back to the United States?
No, they all turned out missionaries. I was the only one that escaped.
Tell them what your mother used to say, that you were in the business of making money.
Well, I was, but I wasn't successful enough to support their.
And my husband told her, well, somebody had to be in the business of making money to send it to the missionaries.
Well, I did my best, but it wasn't enough. Yeah, really, the big financer of Dr. Bell were 2 brothers that were cotton brokers, Clayton's in Houston. I think they were the 2 biggest cotton brokers of that era, and they did support him very much. Any others?
Did
Yes,
they
sir.
get the silver and crystal out of the hiding place? Did that, whatever happened to that? Do you know?
Well, I think my dad got it out, and of course it got lost. But it's all gone. Well, we have a few pieces, don't we, of our family silver?
It was in the hiding place.
Yeah. I think we do, don't we?
I think Sophie has it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think my older sister
With a
has it.
history like that, you know, it'd be nice for
Yeah.
someone in your family.
Yes, it's very
So
definitely.
that's nice, yeah.
Yeah.
Jim, you talked about the difference in the grains that were grown in China.
Yes.
The thing as it is, they broke it up and they get 2 here and 2
Yeah.
there.
Mom,
Well, if you
Our-
just had,
Every 5 children has 2 pieces of it, you know.
but this spoon was in a hiding place in
Yeah.
China. You know,
Yeah.
that's kind of a cool.
Yeah. Our city, Hainan, on the Grand Canal, was right on the borderline between north was wheat country. If you stood on the city wall and looked north, it was wheat and soybean. If you looked south, it was rice. So we were right on that dividing line.
Wet this way and dry that.
Yeah. But that was an old, proud city. Marco Polo came through and got the noodles, which was popular, and took those back to Italy, and we got spaghetti in Italy. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I was wondering when you came to the Gulf Coast and what brought you here?
I was working in South Louisiana, and I've always been a boater, and we had a place up on the Biloxi River on pilings, and I had a boat down in the harbor. It was a schooner, small schooner, classic schooner, 32 feet long. It was plastic instead of wood, so, but it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. In fact, I just cleared it this month. So I've done a lot of sailing out here in the Gulf and made many trips to everywhere, including New York and Mexico and Guatemala and Bahamas. Cuba, twice.
Cuba. Wow.
Yeah. One of my crew had relatives in Cuba, and he was commiserating about the poverty. I said, look, you don't know what poverty is. Because, you know, the people were still well fed and well clothed. And in our area, in my youth, they were not. You know, their clothes were in tatters, and they were thin and famine. They didn't really know what a poor situation it was.
Did you start boating in China or after you got back over here?
Over here. I started in Texas, actually, along the Sabine River
You sure
and
don't
the
love that.
core, yeah. And I just loved it.
Do you have a lot of Chinese playmates?
Not that many, because most of them were so filthy and dirty that my family didn't want them. But we did have some. I think we had a Christian pastor that lived behind us, and he had direct access to our house. And his son we played with. But with the general population, we didn't. One memorable trip, my brother and I was 10, I guess, and he was maybe 7 or 8. We took a 10-mile bicycle trip from our city to the city that Dr. Bell was in, and my dad's traveling companion went with us, but he'd been a former bandit and had a terrible scar, and usually a foreigner would be mobbed almost as you went through, but people would look at him and they weren't sure he was really converted. And he just cleared the path and we weren't bothered.
Last
Yes, ma'am.
question for me, I just want to ask, you know, my parents made me eat. I'm from Charlotte and from Billy Graham, and
Yes,
and I grew up with the Bells and all.
yes.
But my father and mother always made me eat everything on my plate to benefit the children in China.
Yeah.
Did it ever benefit them?
Well, we see the same thing. Any grain or rice that was left on your plate, every
What'd you say?
drop of grain that was left on your plate, said you're going to get a pockmark for that. But it didn't happen. But we had the same admonition, don't waste any food. Is that it?
Look, everybody enjoy this?